Hi, I'm Jessica. When my mother-in-law handed me that crystal glass at her anniversary party, her smile was perfect. Too perfect. The kind of smile that makes your skin crawl because you know there's something lurking underneath. She leaned in, close, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she pressed the glass into my palm and whispered, "This one's made just for you, sweetheart." The way she said sweetheart felt like she was spitting out something bitter. I watched her eyes dart toward the bartender, then back to me, and that's when I knew. This wasn't a peace offering. This was a declaration of war. So I did what any smart woman would do. I made sure she got exactly what she was serving. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Martinez, and I've been married to Mike Thompson for 3 years. 3 years of trying to fit into a family that never wanted me there in the first place. Mike's mother, Patricia, made that crystal clear from day one. Not with screaming or obvious cruelty, but with the kind of polished passive aggression that women like her have perfected into an art form. The subtle corrections, the backhanded compliments, the way she'd introduce me to her friends with just a pause too long before saying my name, as if she had to remind herself what it was. I should have seen the signs earlier, but love makes you hopeful. When Mike first brought me home to meet his parents 3.5 years ago, I was nervous but excited. I'd grown up in a loud, warm Mexican-American family in South Phoenix, where everyone talked over each other at dinner, and your grandmother would pile your plate so high you couldn't see the table underneath. Walking into the Thompson house in North Scottsdale was like stepping into a magazine spread. Everything was beige and cream and perfectly arranged, with not a single thing out of place. Even the fruit in the bowl looked like it had been positioned by an interior designer. Patricia answered the door wearing a pale pink cashmere sweater and pearls, her blonde hair blown out into that ageless style that screams country club luncheons and charity galas. She looked me up and down once, quickly, her eyes taking inventory of my vintage dress and my grandmother's silver earrings. Her smile was polite but distant, the kind you'd give a door-to-door salesperson you're about to dismiss. "You must be Jessica," she said. And even then, something about the way she said my name felt wrong. Not hostile exactly, but like she was, testing how it felt in her mouth and didn't particularly like the taste. Mike was oblivious, of course. Men always are when it comes to the subtle warfare women wage against each other. He was too busy being proud of bringing home someone he loved, too excited about sharing his two worlds. He didn't notice how his mother steered the conversation away every time I mentioned my job at the marketing firm, or how she somehow managed to forget to offer me a drink while making sure his father's glass stayed full. Dinner was an exercise in polite torture. Patricia asked me about my family with the kind of curiosity that felt more like an interrogation. Where did my parents work? How long had they lived in Phoenix? Did I have siblings? Each answer seemed to confirm something for her, though I couldn't tell what. When I mentioned that my dad was a foreman at a construction company and my mom worked as a school secretary, something shifted in her expression. Not disapproval exactly, but a kind of filing away, like she was storing that information for later use. Bob, Mike's father, was kinder. He asked genuine questions about my work and seemed interested in my stories about growing up bilingual. But even he deferred to Patricia when she started talking about Mike's ex-girlfriend, Ashley, who apparently had been such a lovely girl and was now doing so well in her pediatric residency. The way she said it made it clear that Ashley represented some kind of lost opportunity, a path not taken that would have been so much better for everyone involved. Mike squeezed my hand under the table, and I squeezed back, telling myself that this was just first meeting awkwardness. That Patricia needed time to get to know me to see what Mike saw in me. I convinced myself that her coolness was just protective instinct, that any mother would be cautious about someone new in her son's life. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. The engagement period was when Patricia's true feelings became impossible to ignore. Mike proposed on a hiking trail in Sedona, just the two of us and the red rocks and a sunset that looked like it had been painted by God himself. I called my parents, crying happy tears, and they screamed and celebrated and immediately started planning an engagement party. When Mike called his parents, the response was considerably more restrained. "That's wonderful, honey," Patricia said when Mike put her on speaker. "We're so happy for you." But her voice had that flat quality of someone reading from a script, hitting all the right notes without any of the music behind them. The wedding planning was where things got really ugly. My mother wanted to include some of our family traditions, like the Las Aras ceremony, and having a mariachi band for part of the reception. Patricia responded to these suggestions with the kind of strained patience you'd show a child insisting on wearing a Halloween costume to church. "Well, that's very cultural," she said when my mom suggested the mariachi band. "But this is more of a formal affair. Maybe something more classical would be appropriate." She had opinions about everything. My dress was a bit much for a morning ceremony. My cousin couldn't be a bridesmaid because we're trying to keep the wedding party small, even though Mike had 5 groomsmen. The flowers I wanted were too colorful for the venue's aesthetic. Every suggestion I made was met with a gentle but firm redirection toward what Patricia thought was more suitable. The worst part was how she did it all with a smile, as if she was just trying to help me navigate the complex world of proper wedding etiquette. When I finally broke down crying to Mike about feeling like I had no say in my own wedding, he sat down with his mother for what he called a little chat. After that, Patricia backed off on the micromanaging, but the damage was done. I could see it in her eyes at the wedding reception when she looked at me in my too much dress, dancing to music that was too colorful for her taste. I had won this battle, but she was already planning the war. Married life didn't make things easier. If anything, it made Patricia's disapproval more concentrated, more focused. She had a way of making me feel like a guest in my own marriage, constantly questioning decisions Mike and I made together, as if I was some outside influence corrupting her son's judgment. When we bought our townhouse in Tempe, she wondered aloud why we couldn't find something a bit nicer in North Scottsdale, closer to family. When I got promoted to senior marketing coordinator, she asked if the extra hours would interfere with my obligations at home. When we decided to wait a few years before having kids, she started leaving articles about fertility and age around the house during visits, casual suggestions that time was ticking. The most insidious part was how she worked to isolate me from the family narrative. At gatherings, she'd bring up memories that predated me, stories about Mike's childhood or family vacations or holidays where I wasn't present. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd show photo albums full of Mike and Ashley at family events, the two of them looking like the perfect all-American couple that I apparently wasn't. She never said anything directly cruel, but the message was clear. I was a temporary disruption in the natural order of things. Mike's sister Amanda was neutral at best, polite but distant. She'd been close to Ashley too, and I got the sense that she saw me as the reason her friend was no longer part of their family gatherings. Bob tried to include me, but he was clearly more interested in keeping the peace than making waves. In the Thompson family hierarchy, Patricia's approval was everything, and I didn't have it. The breaking point came 6 months ago during Easter dinner. Patricia had prepared her usual elaborate spread, complete with place cards written in her perfect calligraphy. I was seated at the far end of the table, next to Mike's teenage cousin who spent the entire meal texting under the table. During dessert, Patricia stood up to make a toast about family and tradition and the importance of preserving the values that had made the Thompson name something to be proud of. "Some families," she said, looking directly at me, "understand that marriage isn't just about two people. It's about bringing together compatible backgrounds, similar values, shared understanding of what matters." She paused, her wine glass catching the light from the crystal chandelier above. When that harmony exists, when everyone fits naturally into the family structure, beautiful things can happen. The room was silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Mike shifted uncomfortably beside me, but he didn't say anything. Nobody did. Patricia's message was clear without being explicitly stated. I didn't fit naturally into anything, and beautiful things were being prevented by my presence. That night, lying in bed next to my husband, who had once again chosen comfortable silence over defending his wife, I made a decision. I was done trying to earn Patricia's approval. I was done pretending that her subtle cruelty was just personality, differences, or protective motherly instinct. I was done being polite in the face of calculated emotional abuse. What I didn't know was that Patricia was done being subtle too. The anniversary party would be her grand finale, her masterstroke. In the campaign to prove that I didn't belong in her family, she'd spent months planning it, not just the event itself, but the message it would send. I was about to learn exactly how far she was willing to go to make her point. The invitation arrived on expensive cream cardstock with raised gold lettering, announcing the celebration of Robert and Patricia Thompson's 35th wedding anniversary. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Michael Thompson, which was technically correct, but felt like another small erasure of my individual identity. Inside, the details were laid out in Patricia's precise handwriting. Cocktails at 6, dinner at 7, dancing to follow. Black tie requested. The Desert Ridge Country Club, naturally, because Patricia never did anything that wasn't designed to impress. Mike was excited about the party in the way that men get excited about family gatherings, when they don't have to plan them. He talked about how nice it would be to celebrate his parents, how much work his mother had put into organizing everything, how proud he was of their marriage lasting 35 years. I nodded and smiled and made appropriate responses while internally preparing myself for what I knew would be another evening of feeling like an outsider at my own family's celebration. The week before the party, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to contribute something meaningful to the celebration, something that showed I cared about this family even if they didn't particularly care about me. I commissioned a custom photo album from a local artist, filled with pictures spanning Bob and Patricia's entire marriage. I spent hours going through old family photos that Mike had scanned, selecting the best ones and arranging them chronologically. I even included some recent pictures from holidays and gatherings where I'd been present, hoping to show that I saw myself as part of their continuing story. The album was beautiful when it was finished, bound in leather with their names embossed in gold on the cover. I wrapped it carefully in silver paper with a cream ribbon and wrote a heartfelt note about celebrating love that lasts and family bonds that strengthen over time. Looking back, I realize how naive that gesture was, how much hope I'd invested in the idea that maybe this would be the thing that finally proved my good intentions to Patricia. I should have known better. I should have remembered that to someone determined to see you as the enemy, every gesture of friendship looks like a threat. Every attempt at inclusion feels like an invasion. But I was still operating under the assumption that we were two reasonable women who could find common ground if we just tried hard enough. The day of the party, I spent extra time getting ready. I'd found a midnight blue dress that was elegant, without being flashy, sophisticated without trying too hard. I wanted to look like I belonged at a country club celebration, like I was worthy of being Mike's wife and Bob and Patricia's daughter-in-law. I did my makeup carefully and wore the pearl earrings Mike had given me for our second anniversary, the ones Patricia had complimented once in what I'd thought was a genuine moment of approval. Mike looked handsome in his black tuxedo, and for a moment as we got ready together, I let myself feel optimistic about the evening ahead. This was his parents' special night after all. Surely Patricia would be too focused on celebrating with Bob and their friends to spend energy on making me feel unwelcome. Surely she'd want the evening to be perfect for everyone involved. We arrived at the Desert Ridge Country Club just as the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that made the whole venue look like something out of a fairy tale. The club's event space opened onto a terrace overlooking the golf course, with mountains visible in the distance. Patricia had outdone herself with the decorations: cream and gold linens, elaborate floral centerpieces, string lights creating a canopy of stars above the outdoor dance floor. She looked stunning, of course, in a champagne-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Her hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, and she wore the diamond necklace that had been Bob's gift to her on their 20th anniversary. She was in her element, gracefully accepting congratulations and compliments, playing the role of the perfect hostess celebrating a perfect marriage. I watched her work the room, air-kissing friends and family members, posing for photos with various groups of guests. She had a gift for making everyone feel like they were exactly where they needed to be, like they were essential parts of this beautiful celebration. Everyone except me, of course. When our eyes met across the terrace, her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. The cocktail hour was in full swing when Patricia approached me. I was standing near the edge of the terrace, watching the last light fade behind the mountains and listening to Mike chat with his college roommates about their upcoming golf weekend. She appeared beside me like she'd materialized out of the ghee, desert air, holding 2 glasses of what looked like the signature cocktail the bartender had been serving all evening. "Jessica," she said, and her voice was warm and welcoming in a way that immediately put me on guard. "I'm so glad you could make it tonight. You look lovely." I thanked her, accepting the compliment even though something about her tone felt off. She was being too nice, too friendly, too much like the mother-in-law I'd always hoped she might become but never believed she actually could be. "I wanted to give you this," she continued, extending one of the glasses toward me. "It's Carlos's special creation for tonight, a pomegranate martini with a touch of hibiscus. I thought you might appreciate the flavors, given your heritage." The way she said "your heritage" made my spine stiffen. It wasn't exactly offensive, but it wasn't exactly respectful either. It was Patricia's way of othering me while sounding inclusive, of highlighting my difference while pretending to celebrate it. But the drink itself looked beautiful, a deep red color that caught the light from the string lanterns overhead. Ice crystals clung to the rim of the glass, and a thin slice of lime floated on the surface like a small green lily pad. If this was Patricia's attempt at a peace offering, even a calculated one, maybe I should accept it graciously. "That's very thoughtful," I said, reaching for the glass. "Thank you." Patricia's fingers lingered on the stem for just a moment longer than necessary, and in that moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Not warmth or generosity, but something else entirely. Something that looked almost like anticipation. "Enjoy," she said, releasing the glass into my hand. "I made sure Carlos put extra care into this one. It's exactly what you deserve." She turned away before I could respond, gliding back into the crowd with the practiced grace of a woman who'd spent decades perfecting the art of looking effortless at social gatherings. I stood there holding the martini, watching her rejoin a group of her friends near the bar, and trying to shake the feeling that something important had just happened that I didn't fully understand. The glass was cold in my palm, condensation, already forming on the outside. I raised it toward my lips, then hesitated. Something made me look back toward the bar where Patricia had been standing, and what I saw made my blood run cold. She was watching me. Not casually, not the way you might glance at someone across a party. She was staring at me with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for watching a science experiment or waiting for test results. Her conversation with her friends had completely stopped, and she was utterly still, waiting for something very specific to happen. That's when I noticed Carlos, the bartender. He was also looking in my direction, but when our eyes met, he quickly looked away and busied himself with wiping down glasses that were already clean. There was something nervous about his movement, something guilty in the way he avoided my gaze. I thought about Patricia's words as she'd handed me the drink. "It's exactly what you deserve." At the time, I'd interpreted that as a compliment, maybe even an apology. But now, with her watching me so intently, those words took on a completely different meaning. I lowered the glass without taking a sip and made my way back toward where Mike was standing with his friends. I needed to think, needed to figure out what was happening before I did something I might regret. The pomegranate martini remained untouched in my hand, its red surface reflecting the party lights like a warning. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Patricia hadn't just excluded me from family photos or conversations. She hadn't just made subtle digs about my background or questioned my place in Mike's life. This was something else entirely, something that crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. Standing there on the terrace of the Desert Ridge Country Club, holding a drink I suddenly understood I wasn't supposed to survive. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet in a way that had nothing to do with the heels I was wearing. I moved carefully toward the edge of the terrace, away from the clusters of guests and closer to the railing that overlooked the 18th green. The sun had completely disappeared now, leaving only the artificial glow of the party lights and the distant sparkle of Scottsdale stretching out toward the mountains. My hands were shaking, but not from the desert evening chill. I was shaking because I was finally understanding the true scope of what I'd been dealing with for 3 years. Patricia Thompson hadn't just disliked me. She hadn't just wished Mike had married someone else. She had been actively planning my removal from the family, and tonight, at her own anniversary celebration, she was finally making her move. The beautiful setting, the elegant party, the careful planning, it was all window dressing for what was essentially an attempt at murder disguised as hospitality. I thought about all the times I'd questioned myself, wondering if I was being too sensitive or reading too much into her behavior. All the moments when Mike had told me I was imagining things, that his mother was just particular about certain things, that I needed to try harder to understand her perspective. All the nights I'd lain awake wondering what I could do differently to earn her acceptance, what magic combination of words or actions might finally make her see me as worthy of her son. None of it had mattered. None of it had ever mattered. Patricia had made her decision about me long before she ever met me, and everything that had happened since had just been her working toward this moment. The anniversary party wasn't just a celebration of her marriage to Bob. It was going to be the night she finally solved the Jessica problem once and for all. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated me. She had spent so much time thinking of me as an obstacle, to be removed, that she'd forgotten I was actually a person with a brain and survival instincts. She'd been so focused on her own cleverness, her own superiority, that she hadn't considered the possibility that I might notice what she was doing. I looked back across the terrace toward where Patricia was still standing with her friends, and I realized she was no longer watching me. She had turned her attention back to her conversation, laughing at something one of the women had said, playing the part of the gracious hostess celebrating her special evening. But there was something different about her posture now, something relaxed and satisfied, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She thought it was over. She thought I had already drunk whatever she'd put in that glass, and now all she had to do was wait for it to take effect. I wondered how she was planning to explain it when I collapsed. A sudden allergic reaction, perhaps. A previously unknown medical condition. The stress of trying so hard to fit into a family where I didn't belong finally taking its toll. She would comfort Mike through his grief, help him understand that sometimes these things just happened, and probably have Ashley's phone number ready for when he was ready to start dating again. The thought made me sick, but it also made me angry. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger that makes you do stupid things, but the cold, calculating kind that sharpens your thinking and focuses your purpose. Patricia had been playing a long game, methodically working to destroy my marriage and remove me from her family. Well, two could play that game, and I had one significant advantage. She thought she'd already won. I moved back into the crowd, the untouched martini still in my hand, and started paying attention to the party in a completely different way. Instead of worrying about fitting in or making conversation or avoiding Patricia's subtle barbs, I was watching for opportunities. I was studying the layout of the space, the flow of the guests, the patterns of behavior that might give me the chance I needed. The bar where Carlos was working was positioned near the entrance to the indoor dining room, with a clear view of most of the terrace. Several servers were circulating with trays of appetizers and drinks, moving smoothly between the clusters of guests like dancers following choreography they'd performed 100 times before. The band Patricia had hired was setting up in the corner, testing their equipment and running through sound checks while couples began gravitating toward what would become the dance floor. Bob was holding court near the gift table, accepting congratulations and telling stories about the early days of his marriage to Patricia. He looked genuinely happy, the kind of happiness that comes from being surrounded by people who care about you and celebrating something you're proud of. I felt a stab of guilt about what I was planning to do at his anniversary party, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't my choice. Patricia had brought this battle to his celebration, not me. Mike was still with his college friends, but I could see him glancing around the party, probably looking for me. We'd been married long enough that he could sense when I was feeling uncomfortable at family gatherings, and he'd developed a habit of checking in with me periodically to make sure I was okay. Under normal circumstances, I appreciated that attention. Tonight, it was going to complicate things. I needed to move soon, before he came looking for me and before Patricia started wondering why I was still standing upright. But I also needed to be smart about it. Whatever I did had to look completely natural, completely innocent. There couldn't be any suggestion that it was anything other than an accident. That's when I saw my opportunity. Bob had moved away from the gift table to join a conversation with some of his old teaching colleagues, leaving his drink unattended on the white linen tablecloth. It was the same type of glass Patricia had given me, the same red liquid that Carlos had been serving all evening. He'd apparently ordered the signature cocktail too, probably at Patricia's suggestion. How sweet, I thought. How perfectly ironic. I made my way toward the gift table, moving casually, as if I was just wandering around the party and admiring the decorations. Several other guests were doing the same thing, and no one paid any attention to me as I approached. The table was beautifully arranged with presents wrapped in elegant paper and tied with silk ribbons, everything perfectly coordinated to match Patricia's color scheme. I set my own drink down next to Bob's, then pretended to examine one of the larger gift boxes more closely. From this angle, I could see both glasses clearly, and they looked absolutely identical. Same red liquid, same crystal stemware, same lime garnish floating on the surface. The only difference was that one contained whatever Patricia thought would solve her Jessica problem, and the other was just a regular pomegranate martini with hibiscus. The switch took less than 3 seconds. I simply picked up Bob's glass instead of my own when I straightened up, leaving the poisoned drink in its place. To anyone watching, it would look like I'd picked up the same glass I'd set down. Bob would return to find what appeared to be his own drink exactly where he'd left it. I moved away from the table quickly but not hurriedly, walking back toward the edge of the terrace where I'd been standing before. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone at the party could hear it, but when I looked around, nobody seemed to be paying any attention to me at all. The switch had been invisible, unremarkable, perfect. Now all I had to do was wait and watch, and see how Patricia reacted when her carefully laid plan began to unravel in exactly the way she hadn't anticipated. Bob returned to the gift table about 10 minutes later, laughing at something one of his friends had said about retirement and golf handicaps. He picked up the glass without hesitation, raising it in a small toast to the friend before taking a healthy sip. Then another. Whatever Patricia had put in there, it apparently didn't taste any different from the regular cocktail. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what she'd used or how quickly it would take effect, but I assumed it would be relatively fast. You couldn't slip someone something at a party and then wait hours for it to work. Too many variables, too many chances for someone to notice that something was wrong and get help. Patricia was still chatting with her friends, but I noticed she'd positioned herself where she could see both the gift table and the area where I'd been standing earlier. She was trying to keep track of both Bob and me without being obvious about it, which meant she was probably expecting something to happen soon, too. It started about 15 minutes after Bob had taken his first sip. He was in the middle of telling a story about one of his former students when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence, his hand going to his throat. At first, it just looked like he'd swallowed wrong or needed to clear his throat. But then his face started to change. The color drained from his cheeks, and he blinked several times as if he was having trouble focusing. "Honey?" Patricia's voice cut across the terrace, sharp with what sounded like concern, but felt like something else entirely. "Are you all right?" Bob tried to answer, but the words came out slurred and unclear. He took a step toward her and stumbled slightly, catching himself on the edge of the gift table. The sound of his hand hitting the table was loud enough that several nearby guests turned to look, their conversations trailing off as they realized something was wrong. "I feel," Bob started to say, then stopped, shaking his head as if he was trying to clear it. "I feel strange. Dizzy." Patricia was at his side immediately, her arm around his waist, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You need to sit down, sweetheart. You've been on your feet all evening." But even as she was helping him toward a chair, I could see her eyes scanning the crowd, looking for me. Looking for the woman who should have been collapsing instead of her husband. When our gazes met across the terrace, I saw the exact moment when she realized what had happened. Her face went through a series of micro-expressions too fast for anyone else to catch. Confusion, understanding, rage, and then a kind of blank shock as the full implications hit her. She had poisoned her own husband. At their anniversary party, in front of 75 witnesses, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it without admitting what she'd been trying to do to me. Bob was getting worse. His speech was becoming more slurred, and he was having trouble staying upright even with Patricia supporting him. Several guests were crowding around now, asking if they should call 911, suggesting that maybe he'd had too much to drink or eaten something that disagreed with him. "Maybe it was the shellfish," someone suggested. "Sometimes allergic reactions can come on suddenly." "Should we call an ambulance?" asked another voice. Patricia was trapped. She couldn't object to getting Bob medical help without raising suspicions about why she wouldn't want doctors examining him. But she also couldn't let them call 911 without risking questions about what might have caused his sudden illness. Questions that might lead to blood tests and investigations and discoveries that would destroy her completely. "Let's just get him inside where it's cooler," she said, her voice strained but still trying to sound calm. "Maybe he just needs to sit down for a few minutes." But Bob was beyond sitting down and feeling better. Whatever she'd put in that drink was serious, and it was working exactly as she'd intended it to work. His knees buckled, and it took 3 men to keep him from hitting the ground. His breathing was becoming labored, and there was a grayish tinge to his skin that made several of the guests step back in alarm. "Call 911, Mike's voice cut through the chaos. He'd appeared at the edge of the crowd, his phone already in his hand. "This isn't something you wait out. Dad needs a hospital." Patricia tried to object, tried to suggest that they should wait a few more minutes to see if Bob improved on his own, but she was outnumbered. Too many people had seen how quickly he'd deteriorated, and nobody was willing to take chances with a man's life just because his wife thought medical attention might be an overreaction. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, which felt like hours. By then, Bob was barely conscious, his responses to questions slow and confused. The EMTs worked quickly and efficiently, checking his vital signs and asking Patricia rapid-fire questions about his medical history, current medications, and what he'd consumed that evening. "Has he eaten or drunk anything unusual tonight?" one of them asked. "Any new medications? Any changes to his routine? Patricia's hesitation was so brief that probably no one else noticed it, but I caught it. That tiny pause where she had to decide how to answer, what story to tell that wouldn't lead back to her. Just the signature cocktail, she said finally. The same thing everyone else has been drinking all evening. Which was technically true, except that not everyone else's cocktail had been specially prepared with whatever she'd intended to use to solve her Jessica problem. The EMT made a note on his clipboard and continued his assessment, while Patricia stood by looking like the concerned wife she was supposed to be. They loaded Bob into the ambulance within another 10 minutes, Patricia climbing in beside him after giving hurried instructions to Amanda about handling the guests and cleaning up the party. The anniversary celebration was officially over, but most of the guests lingered, talking in hushed tones about what could have caused such a sudden collapse in a man who'd seemed perfectly healthy just an hour earlier. I stayed until the end, helping Amanda and Mike clean up and making appropriate noises about hoping Bob would be okay, and how scary it must have been for Patricia to see her husband collapse like that. Inside, though, I was calm. Calmer than I'd been in years, actually, because for the first time since I'd joined this family, I wasn't the one being victimized. I wasn't the one scrambling to defend myself or explain my behavior or prove that I belonged. Patricia had made her move and it had backfired spectacularly. Now she was the one who had to explain what had happened. The one who had to maintain a story under pressure. The one who had to worry about what people might discover if they looked too closely at the events of the evening. But I knew this was just the beginning. Patricia wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, especially not when defeat meant potentially facing consequences for attempted murder. She would regroup, she would adapt, and she would come at me again. But next time, I would be ready for her. Next time, I wouldn't be the naive daughter-in-law hoping for acceptance from a woman who saw me as nothing more than a problem to be solved. Mike drove us home in silence, both of us exhausted by the evening's events and worried about Bob's condition. The hospital had admitted him for observation and testing, but the doctors weren't sure yet what had caused his collapse. They were running blood work and waiting for results, treating his symptoms while they tried to determine the underlying cause. I can't believe this happened, Mike said as we pulled into our driveway. He seemed fine all day. A little tired, maybe, but fine. And then just like that. He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he was thinking. How quickly everything could change. How a perfect evening could turn into a nightmare without warning. What he didn't know was that this hadn't been a random medical emergency or a freak accident. This had been a carefully planned attack that had simply hit the wrong target. "Your mom must be terrified," I said, because that was what a concerned daughter-in-law would say. This has to be her worst nightmare, having something like this happen at their anniversary party. Mike nodded, already reaching for his phone to call the hospital and check on his father's condition. I should have stayed. I should have gone with them in the ambulance. There wasn't room, I reminded him. And your mom needed someone to handle things here. You did the right thing. But as I watched him dial the hospital's number, I wondered how long it would take for the blood tests to come back. How long before someone started asking harder questions about what Bob had consumed that evening. How long before Patricia realized that her perfect crime had become a perfect disaster, with all the evidence pointing straight back to her. I went upstairs to change out of my cocktail dress, hanging it carefully in the closet and putting away the pearl earrings that had seemed so important just a few hours earlier. In the bathroom mirror, I looked exactly the same as I had when we'd left for the party, but everything felt different. The woman looking back at me wasn't the same person who'd spent 3 years trying to earn Patricia Thompson's approval. This woman knew exactly who her enemy was, and she was ready to fight back. The hospital called at 3 a.m. Mike's phone buzzed against the nightstand, pulling us both from the restless sleep we'd finally managed to find. I watched him fumble for the device in the dark, his voice thick with exhaustion as he answered. "Hello? Yes, this is Mike Thompson." A pause. What? Are you sure? Another longer pause, and I could hear the tension creeping into his voice. We'll be right there. He hung up and turned on the bedside lamp, the sudden brightness making us both squint. His face was pale, and there was something in his expression that made my stomach clench with anticipation. They found something in Dad's blood work, he said, already reaching for his clothes. The doctor wants to talk to us in person. They wouldn't say what it was over the phone, but they're treating it as a potential poisoning case now. I felt a flutter of something that might have been panic, but I forced my voice to stay steady. Poisoning? How is that possible? I don't know. Mike was pulling on yesterday's shirt, his movements sharp and agitated. But they've called the police. There's going to be an investigation. We drove to the hospital in silence, the empty Phoenix Street stretching out under the fluorescent glow of streetlights. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my face carefully arranged in the expression of concerned confusion that any innocent person would wear in this situation. Inside, though, my mind was racing through possibilities and contingencies, trying to anticipate what might come next. The hospital's emergency department had a different energy at 3 a.m. Quieter but more intense, with the kind of focused urgency that comes when there aren't distractions or routine cases to dilute the serious ones. We found Patricia in the family waiting area, still wearing her champagne-colored dress from the party, but looking nothing like the elegant hostess she'd been just hours earlier. Her makeup was smudged, her hair disheveled, and there was a hollow look in her eyes that I'd never seen before. "How is he?" Mike asked immediately, taking the seat beside her. "Stable," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They have him on some kind of medication to counteract whatever was in his system. The doctor said if we'd waited much longer to get him here." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air between us. A few minutes later, Dr. Martinez appeared, a tired-looking woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent too many years delivering difficult news to families in crisis. She gestured for us to follow her to a small consultation room down the hall where she could speak to us privately. "Your father has been poisoned," she said without preamble, her attention focused on Mike. "The blood work shows significant levels of a compound called oleander toxin. It's derived from the oleander plant, which is actually quite common in Arizona landscaping, but it's extremely dangerous when ingested." Patricia made a small sound that might have been a gasp or might have been something else entirely. "Oleander? But how would he have gotten that?" "That's what the police are going to want to determine," Dr. Martinez said. "The amount in his system suggests this wasn't accidental exposure. Someone would have had to extract the toxin and deliberately introduce it into something he consumed." Mike was staring at the doctor with the kind of blank incomprehension that comes when reality suddenly stops making sense. "You're saying someone tried to kill my father?" "I'm saying someone poisoned him with a potentially lethal substance," Dr. Martinez corrected. "Whether the intent was murder or just to make him sick, I can't say. But the dose was significant enough that without medical intervention, the outcome could have been very serious." Patricia was twisting her wedding ring around her finger, the same nervous habit I'd noticed during other high-stress family situations. But there was something different about her agitation now. Something that went beyond normal worry about a spouse's health. "Will there be permanent damage?" she asked. "It's too early to say definitively, but we're optimistic," the doctor replied. "We caught it relatively quickly, and he's responding well to treatment. However, the police will want to interview all of you about the events leading up to his collapse. They'll need to know everything he ate and drank yesterday, everyone he interacted with, any possible sources of exposure." After Dr. Martinez left, the three of us sat in the consultation room for several minutes without speaking. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and somewhere down the hall, a phone was ringing with the persistent urgency of a call that needed to be answered. Finally, Mike broke the silence. "I don't understand any of this," he said. "Who would..." Want to hurt Dad? He doesn't have enemies. He's a retired teacher, for God's sake. He spends his time reading and working in the garden and playing golf with his buddies. Patricia was still twisting her ring, her eyes fixed on some point on the far wall. Maybe it wasn't meant for him, she said quietly. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt Mike's attention shift toward her. What do you mean? I mean, maybe someone made a mistake, Patricia continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. Maybe whoever did this was targeting someone else, and Bob just happened to drink the wrong thing. It was masterful, really. She was laying the groundwork for her defense without actually making any accusations yet. Planting the seed of the idea that this had been a case of mistaken identity, that Bob had been an unintended victim of someone else's malicious plan. And there was only one other person at that party who would have made sense as an alternative target. But who? Mike asked, still not following the thread his mother was weaving. Patricia turned to look at me for the first time since we'd arrived at the hospital, and I saw something calculating in her expression. I gave Jessica a special cocktail last night, she said. The same type of glass, the same red color as what Bob was drinking. If someone wanted to poison one of us, it would have been very easy to mix up the glasses. The accusation was so smooth, so reasonable sounding, that for a moment I almost admired her skill. She was turning the situation around, positioning herself as another potential victim, while simultaneously suggesting that I had been the real target. It was a story that would explain the oleander poisoning while making her look innocent and me look like someone with dangerous enemies. You think someone was trying to poison Jessica? Mike's voice was incredulous. I don't know what to think, Patricia said, and there was just the right amount of confusion and fear in her tone. But it's the only thing that makes sense. Why would anyone want to hurt Bob? But Jessica. She let the sentence trail off, as if she was reluctant to voice whatever suspicions she had. But Jessica what? Mike demanded. Patricia glanced at me again, and I could see her making calculations, deciding how far to push this narrative without going so far that it would be obviously fabricated. Well, she hasn't always gotten along with everyone in the family. There have been tensions. And some people might feel that she doesn't belong, that she's caused problems. It was brilliant and horrifying at the same time. She was taking every moment of conflict, every instance of resistance to my presence in the family, and reframing it as evidence that someone might want me dead. She was turning her own campaign of exclusion and hostility into proof that I was a divisive figure who had inspired murderous hatred in some unnamed family member or friend. Mike was looking back and forth between us, trying to process what his mother was suggesting. That's insane. Nobody in our family would try to kill anyone regardless of how they felt about family dynamics. I hope you're right, Patricia said. But the police are going to ask these questions anyway. They're going to want to know about any conflicts, any tensions, any reasons why someone might have wanted to hurt one of us. And if they find out that Jessica was supposed to drink that cocktail instead of Bob. She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. If the police believed that I had been the intended target, they would start looking for someone with a motive to kill me. And Patricia had just spent 3 years creating a documented history of family members who had reasons to dislike me. This is ridiculous, I said, speaking for the first time since we'd arrived at the hospital. I can't believe we're even discussing this. Someone poisoned Bob, and instead of trying to figure out who actually did it, you're creating conspiracy theories about people targeting me. Patricia's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction crossing her face. I'm not creating anything, Jessica. I'm just trying to understand what happened. And the fact is, you were supposed to drink that cocktail. If the glasses got switched somehow. How would the glasses have gotten switched? Mike asked. Were you not paying attention to what you were drinking? It was a reasonable question, and one that I needed to answer carefully. I set my glass down at some point during the evening, I said. Near the gift table, I think. When I picked it up again, I just assumed it was the same one. See? Patricia said, and there was a note of vindication in her voice. It would have been so easy for someone to switch them. Bob left his drink there too when he was talking to his friends. Someone could have tampered with one glass thinking it was the other. The story was taking shape beautifully from her perspective. An unknown family member or friend with a grudge against me had poisoned what they thought was my drink, but Bob had accidentally consumed it instead. It explained the oleander toxin. It explained why Bob had been the victim instead of the intended target, and it shifted all suspicion away from Patricia while simultaneously painting me as someone controversial enough to inspire murder attempts. The police arrived an hour later, 2 detectives who introduced themselves as Martinez and Chen. They were professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about the timeline of the evening, the guest list, and everyone's movements during the party. They wanted to know about the catering arrangements, the bar service, and specifically about the signature cocktails that had been served. When they asked about the glasses and how Bob might have consumed oleander toxin, Patricia repeated her theory about the switched drinks. She explained how she'd given me a special cocktail, how both Bob and I had left our glasses near the gift table at various points, and how easy it would have been for someone to confuse them or deliberately switch them. So you believe Mrs. Thompson was the intended target? Detective Martinez asked. Patricia hesitated, playing the part of the reluctant witness who didn't want to make accusations, but felt compelled to tell the truth. I don't know for certain, but it's the only explanation that makes sense to me. Bob doesn't have enemies. He's the most gentle, kind man you could ever meet. But there have been some family tensions lately. Some people who felt that Jessica didn't quite fit in with our group. What kind of tensions? Detective Chen asked, his pen poised over his notebook. And there it was. The opening Patricia had been maneuvering toward, the chance to lay out every moment of conflict and resistance as evidence of a potential murder motive. She would be careful, of course. She wouldn't make direct accusations or name specific suspects. But she would paint a picture of a family divided, of resentments and hostilities that had been building over time, all centered around my disruptive presence. Well, she began, and I could hear the reluctance in her voice that was entirely for the detective's benefit. There were some people who felt that the marriage happened very quickly. Some concerns about compatibility, about different backgrounds and values. Nothing serious, we all thought, but she went on to describe a version of family history that was technically accurate, but completely recontextualized. Every awkward holiday dinner became evidence of brewing conflict. Every moment when I'd felt excluded or unwelcome became proof that other family members harbored dangerous resentments. Every attempt I'd made to defend myself or assert my place in the family became an example of the kind of behavior that might drive someone to desperate measures. Mike listened to his mother's recitation with growing alarm, clearly hearing many of these incidents for the first time or understanding their significance in a new way. I could see him starting to question things, starting to wonder if there had been undercurrents in his family that he'd been too oblivious to notice. When the detectives finished with Patricia, they turned their attention to me. Their questions were more pointed, more focused on my relationships with specific family members and any conflicts I might have had with other guests at the party. Did you notice anyone acting strangely around your drink? Detective Martinez asked. Anyone who seemed to be paying unusual attention to what you were consuming? I thought about Patricia watching me so intently after she'd handed me the cocktail, waiting for me to drink it. But I couldn't say that without revealing that I suspected her of being the poisoner. Instead, I shook my head. Not that I noticed. I was just trying to enjoy the party and celebrate Bob and Patricia's anniversary. Your mother-in-law mentioned that there have been some family tensions, Detective Chen said. Can you tell us about those? This was dangerous territory. If I downplayed the conflicts, it would make Patricia's theory about targeted poisoning seem less credible, but it might also make me look like I was hiding something. If I acknowledged the tensions, I would be validating her narrative about me being a divisive figure who inspired strong negative reactions. There have been some adjustment periods, I said carefully. Marriage always involves bringing together different families and different backgrounds. Patricia and I haven't always seen eye to eye on everything, but I wouldn't characterize it as serious conflict. What kinds of things haven't you seen eye to eye on? Detective Martinez pressed. I could feel Patricia watching me, waiting to see how I would answer, ready to contradict anything that didn't fit her preferred narrative. Wedding planning decisions, holiday traditions, normal family stuff that gets worked out over time. It was a bland diplomatic answer that revealed nothing and satisfied no one, but it was safe. I wasn't giving the detectives any ammunition to use against me, and I wasn't providing Patricia with any openings to elaborate on her theory about dangerous family resentments. When the police interview was over, we were allowed to see Bob for a few minutes. He was awake but groggy, connected to several monitors and an IV drip that was delivering the medication to counteract the oleander toxin. His color was better than it had been at the party, but he still looked weak and confused. "How are you feeling?" Mike asked, taking his father's hand. "Like I got hit by a truck," Bob said, his voice hoarse. "The doctors said someone poisoned me. Is that really what happened?" Patricia moved to the other side of the bed, smoothing his hair back from his forehead with the kind of tender gesture that would have looked loving if I hadn't known what I now knew about her. "We're still trying to figure it all out," she said. "The police think someone might have been trying to hurt Jessica, and you accidentally drank her cocktail instead." Bob's eyes shifted to me, and I saw confusion and something that might have been sympathy. "Jessica? But why would anyone want to hurt Jessica?" It was such a simple, innocent question, asked by a man who had never been anything but kind to me, and who couldn't imagine why anyone would wish me harm. And in that moment, I realized how completely Patricia had managed to corrupt the narrative. Even her own husband, the man she had nearly killed, was now thinking of me as the victim and her as the concerned family member trying to make sense of a senseless attack. "We don't know," Patricia said, and her voice carried just the right note of protective concern. "But we're going to make sure you're safe, and we're going to find out who did this." As we left the hospital that morning, I understood that the game had entered a new phase. Patricia had successfully repositioned herself from potential suspect to concerned family member, and she had created a narrative that explained Bob's poisoning while simultaneously making me look like someone controversial enough to inspire murder attempts. When the police investigation continued, they would be looking for someone with a motive to kill me, not someone with a motive to kill Bob. But she had made one crucial error in her rush to deflect suspicion from herself. She had assumed that I was passive, that I would simply react to her moves instead of making moves of my own. She had spent so much time thinking of me as a victim that she had forgotten I might also be a strategist, and I was about to remind her of that oversight. The breakthrough came 3 days later, but not from the police investigation. It came from Linda Rodriguez, the photographer Patricia had hired for the anniversary party. I'd completely forgotten about her until she called my cell phone Tuesday afternoon while I was at work, her voice hesitant but determined. "Jessica? This is Linda Rodriguez. I was the photographer at the Thompson anniversary party on Saturday. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I got your number from the emergency contact sheet they had me fill out before the event." I stepped away from my desk and found a quiet corner of the office where I could talk privately. "Of course, Linda. How can I help you?" "Well, I've been following the news about what happened to Mr. Thompson, and I keep thinking about something I captured that night. I shoot everything digitally, and I have this habit of taking candid shots throughout the evening, not just the posed family photos. I caught something on camera that I think you need to see." My heart started beating faster, but I kept my voice calm. What kind of something? It's hard to explain over the phone. Can we meet somewhere? I have the photos on my laptop, and I think you should see them before I decide what to do with them. We arranged to meet at Copper Star Cafe in Tempe an hour later. Linda was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her laptop open and a large coffee growing cold beside her. She was a woman in her mid-40s with streaked gray hair and the kind of observant eyes that probably made her good at capturing moments people didn't realize were happening. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as I sat down. "I've been going back and forth about this for days. I don't want to cause trouble for anyone, but I also can't stop thinking about what I saw." She turned her laptop toward me, and I found myself looking at a series of photos from the anniversary party. The first few were standard event photography, guests mingling on the terrace, Patricia and Bob posing by their cake, the band setting, up their equipment. Then Linda clicked to a photo that made my breath catch. It was Patricia at the bar, leaning close to Carlos the bartender. The angle of the shot captured her profile clearly, and there was something in her hand. Something small and dark that she was holding just above one of the red cocktail glasses. "I didn't think anything of it at the time," Linda said. "I thought maybe she was adding a garnish or adjusting the drink presentation for photos. But when I heard about the poisoning, I started looking at these shots more carefully." She clicked to the next image. This one showed Patricia handing the glass to me, her smile bright and welcoming. But there was something in her posture that looked different when you knew what to look for. Something predatory and expectant. "There's more," Linda said, advancing through several more photos. "Look at this sequence here." The next series of shots showed the gift table area where I'd made the switch. Linda had been photographing the elaborate present display when she'd inadvertently captured me setting down my glass and picking up Bob's. The photos were taken from an angle that made it clear what had happened, that the glasses had been deliberately switched rather than accidentally confused. "You switched the drinks," Linda said, and it wasn't a question. "You knew something was wrong with yours, and you switched them." I stared at the photos, my mind racing through implications and possibilities. Linda had evidence that could completely change the direction of the police investigation. She had proof that Patricia had tampered with my drink, and proof that I had knowingly switched it with Bob's. The question was what she planned to do with that evidence. "What do you want?" I asked. Linda looked surprised by the directness of the question. "I want to know what really happened that night, because these photos tell a very different story than what I'm hearing on the news." I made a decision that probably wasn't smart but felt necessary. Linda had already seen enough to understand the basics of what had occurred, and trying to lie to her would only make me look more guilty if she decided to take the photos to the police. "Patricia has been trying to get rid of me since the day I married her son," I said. "She's made my life miserable for 3 years, but I never thought she'd actually try to kill me. When she handed me that drink, and I saw the way she was watching me, waiting for something to happen, I realized what she'd done. So yes, I switched the glasses. I gave her husband the poison she meant for me." Linda nodded slowly, as if this confirmed what she'd already suspected. "The police think someone was trying to poison you and accidentally got Bob instead. That's the story Patricia is telling them. She's very good at manipulating narratives to make herself look innocent. But you have no proof that she poisoned the drink." "Not until now," I said, gesturing toward her laptop. "Those photos show her adding something to my cocktail. Combined with the fact that I switched the glasses, it's pretty clear what happened." Linda was quiet for a long moment, studying the images on her screen. Finally, she looked up at me with the expression I couldn't quite read. "I have a daughter," she said. "She's 26, married to a man whose mother has never liked her. Not on this level, obviously, but I've watched my daughter try to earn approval from a woman who was determined not to give it. I've seen how it eats away at someone's self-worth. how it poisons relationships and makes you question your own sanity." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "What Patricia did to you was attempted murder. What you did to Bob was self-defense, even if it meant he got hurt instead of you. But if I take these photos to the police, you're both going to be in serious trouble." "So, what are you suggesting?" Linda closed her laptop and leaned back, in her chair. "I'm suggesting that maybe there's a way to handle this that gets you justice without destroying everyone in the process. Patricia tried to kill you. She needs to face consequences for that. But those consequences don't necessarily have to come from the criminal justice system." Over the next hour, Linda and I worked out a plan that was risky, but felt more satisfying than simply turning everything over to the police. The photos gave us leverage that we could use to force Patricia into a corner, to make her face the consequences of her actions without necessarily sending her to prison, or creating a public scandal that would destroy the entire family. The first step was getting Patricia alone, away from Mike and Bob and anyone else who might complicate the conversation. Linda suggested that I invite Patricia to lunch under the pretense of wanting to discuss the ongoing police investigation and our concerns about family safety. It was the kind of meeting that would seem completely reasonable given the circumstances, and it would give us the opportunity to show her what we knew. I called Patricia that evening, adopting the worried, confused tone of a daughter-in-law, who was struggling to understand what had happened at the anniversary party. "Patricia, I keep thinking about what you said at the hospital, about someone maybe targeting me instead of Bob. It's terrifying to think that someone in the family might actually want me dead." "I know, sweetheart," Patricia said, and her voice carried exactly the right note of maternal concern. "But we're going to figure this out. The police are investigating, and they'll find whoever did this." "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. Could we meet for lunch tomorrow? I have some ideas about who might have had access to the drinks that night, and I think we should coordinate what we tell the police so we don't accidentally contradict each other." Patricia agreed immediately, probably thinking that a private conversation would give her the opportunity to further refine her narrative and make sure I was fully committed to the story about me being the intended target. We arranged to meet at a quiet restaurant in Old Town Scottsdale, the kind of place where we could talk without being overheard. Linda positioned herself at a table across the restaurant with her laptop, close enough to observe but far enough, away that Patricia wouldn't notice her. We'd rehearsed the conversation, planned out how to present the evidence in a way that would make Patricia understand her position without giving her time to come up with defensive strategies. Patricia arrived looking perfectly composed, dressed in a cream-colored blouse and tailored pants that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. She'd had her hair done since the hospital visit, and her makeup was flawless. If you didn't know what she'd attempted to do, you'd think she was just another elegant Scottsdale matron meeting a friend for lunch. "How are you holding up?" she asked as she sat down, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand in a gesture of solidarity. "This whole situation must be so frightening for you." "It is," I agreed. "That's why I wanted to talk to you. I keep thinking about that night, trying to remember if I noticed anything strange, anyone who seemed to be paying too much attention to what I was drinking." We ordered our meals and made small talk about Bob's recovery and the ongoing police investigation. Patricia repeated her theory about the switched glasses, elaborating on her suspicions about which family members might have harbored secret resentments against me. She was building her case methodically, creating a detailed narrative. That would explain every aspect of the poisoning while keeping herself firmly in the role of concerned mother-in-law. When our salads arrived, I decided it was time to change the direction of the conversation. "Actually, Patricia, I did remember something about that night. Something that's been bothering me." She looked up from her food, and I caught a flicker of wariness in her expression. "What's that?" "I remembered watching you talk to the bartender before you brought me that drink. You were leaning in close, saying something to him. At the time, I thought you were just giving him special instructions about the cocktail, but now I'm wondering if someone might have approached you earlier and asked you to add something to my drink." It was a careful way to present the information, giving Patricia a potential out while making it clear that I knew about her conversation with Carlos. If she wanted to maintain her innocence, she could claim that someone else had given her the poison and asked her to put it in my drink without telling her what it was. But Patricia was too smart to fall for such an obvious trap. Her expression didn't change, but I saw her calculating, trying to figure out how much I actually knew and how dangerous this conversation might become. "I don't recall talking to the bartender about anything unusual," she said carefully. "I might have asked him to make sure your drink was properly garnished, since it was a special occasion. Are you suggesting that someone used me to poison your cocktail without my knowledge?" "I'm not suggesting anything," I said. "I'm just trying to remember everything that happened that night, since the police are going to want every detail." That's when Linda appeared at our table, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder and her expression serious but not hostile. "Excuse me," she said to Patricia. "I don't know if you remember me. I'm Linda Rodriguez, the photographer from your anniversary party. I was hoping I could speak with both of you about something I discovered while editing the photos from that evening." Patricia's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, recognition, and then a careful blankness as she tried to figure out what Linda's presence might mean. "Of course," Patricia said. "Please, sit down. Is this about the police? Investigation?" Linda took the seat beside me and opened her laptop, positioning it so both Patricia and I could see the screen. "In a way, yes. I've been going through all the photos I took that night, and I found some images that I think might be relevant to what happened to your husband." She opened the first photo, the one showing Patricia at the bar with something in her hand above, the cocktail glass. Patricia stared at the image for a long moment, and I watched her face carefully for any sign of what she was thinking. "I'm not sure what I'm looking at," Patricia said finally. Linda clicked to the next photo, the one showing Patricia handing me the drink, and then to the series showing me switching the glasses at the gift table. With each image, Patricia's composure cracked a little more, until she was sitting rigid in her chair with her hands clenched in her lap. "These photos tell an interesting story," Linda said conversationally. "They show you tampering with Jessica's drink, and they show Jessica switching that drink with your husband's. Given that your husband was poisoned with oleander toxin, I think we can piece together what really happened that night." Patricia was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the laptop screen. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" It was Linda who answered. "We want you to take responsibility for what you did. We want you to stop lying to the police and trying to frame Jessica for something you did. And we want you to make sure this never happens again." "And if I don't?" "Then these photos go to the police, along with a detailed explanation of what they show. You'll be arrested for attempted murder, and your carefully constructed reputation will be destroyed completely." Patricia looked back and forth between us, and I could see her weighing her options. She could try to deny everything, claim the photos were misleading or taken out of context, but she was smart enough to know that the evidence was overwhelming, especially combined with the toxicology report showing oleander in Bob's system. "You can't prove I intended to kill anyone," she said finally. "Maybe I was just trying to make Jessica sick, to embarrass her at the party. Maybe I never meant for it to be life-threatening." "Oleander toxin is always potentially life-threatening," Linda replied. "And intent doesn't matter as much as you might think. Poisoning someone is a serious felony regardless of whether you meant to kill them or just hurt them." Patricia was trapped, and she knew it. The photos provided clear evidence of her tampering with my drink, and my switching of the glasses explained how Bob had ended up consuming the poison instead of me. There was no way to explain away the facts, no narrative she could construct that would make her look innocent. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she asked. I leaned forward, feeling a sense of power that I hadn't experienced in 3 years of marriage into this family. "First, you're going to call Detective Martinez. and tell him that you've remembered some additional details about the night of the party. You're going to tell him that you saw someone tampering with the drinks near the gift table, but you can't be sure who it was because you were distracted by other guests. Patricia's eyes flashed with anger. You want me to lie to the police? I want you to tell them a story that's close enough to the truth to be believable, but vague enough that it doesn't point to any specific suspect, I corrected. You're going to suggest that maybe the poisoning was random, that someone with a grudge against the family in general decided to cause chaos at your anniversary party. And then? Then you're going to start treating me like a member of this family. No more subtle digs, no more exclusion from events, no more attempts to undermine my marriage to your son. You're going to be the supportive mother-in-law you should have been from the beginning. And if I refuse? Linda closed the laptop with a soft click. Then you'll be explaining to a jury why you tried to murder your daughter-in-law at your own anniversary party. Your choice. Patricia sat in silence for several minutes, staring out the restaurant window at the Scottsdale street scene beyond. Finally, she turned back to us with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the polished hostility I was used to, not the fake warmth she deployed when she needed to seem loving, but something that might have been respect. You're not what I thought you were, she said to me. No, I agreed. I'm not. Patricia called Detective Martinez that afternoon and provided him with the amended version of events we'd discussed. She told him she'd remembered seeing someone near the gift table area who seemed to be acting strangely around the drinks, but she couldn't identify who it was or say definitively that they'd done anything wrong. She suggested that maybe the poisoning had been a random act by someone with a grudge against the family, rather than a targeted attack on any specific individual. The detective seemed satisfied with this new information, especially since it supported his working theory that the poisoning had been somewhat random and opportunistic rather than carefully planned. Without any clear suspects or obvious motives, the investigation eventually went cold, filed away as one of those cases where everyone knew a crime had been committed but couldn't prove who had done it. Bob recovered completely within 2 weeks, with no lasting effects from the oleander toxin. He never learned the truth about what had happened that night, and I saw no reason to tell him. He'd been an innocent victim of his wife's hatred for me, and there was no point in destroying his marriage over something he couldn't have prevented. The real change came in Patricia's behavior toward me. It wasn't a complete transformation overnight, but it was noticeable enough that even Mike commented on it. She started including me in family planning conversations, asking my opinion about holiday arrangements and vacation destinations. She stopped making subtle digs about my background or my job, and she actually began introducing me to her friends as her daughter-in-law instead of just Mike's wife. Most importantly, she never again made me feel like I was a temporary disruption in her family's natural order. Whether this change came from genuine respect, fear of the consequences if she crossed me again, or simply the recognition that I wasn't going to disappear quietly, I didn't particularly care. What mattered was that the warfare was over, and I had won. 6 months later, Mike and I were having dinner at his parents' house when Patricia brought out a photo album from their anniversary party. Linda had delivered the edited collection of pictures a week after our restaurant meeting, with all the incriminating images carefully excluded. What remained were beautiful shots of the celebration, the elegant decorations, the happy couple, surrounded by family and friends. It really was a lovely party, Patricia said as we flipped through the pages. Even with everything that happened afterward, I'm glad we have these memories. She paused at a photo of the three of us together, Mike and me flanking her on the terrace with the desert sunset glowing behind us. In the picture, we looked like a happy family, 3 generations connected by love and mutual respect. I should frame this one, Patricia said, for the living room mantel. I looked at the photo and then at my mother-in-law, this woman who had tried to kill me and then been forced to accept me as an equal. There was something almost peaceful about her expression now, as if the resolution of our conflict had lifted a weight she'd been carrying for years. "That would be nice," I said. "I think it captures something important about our family." And it did. Not the surface harmony that Patricia had always tried to project, but something deeper and more honest. It captured the understanding that families are complicated, that love and hatred can exist in the same space, and that sometimes the strongest relationships are the ones that survive attempts at destruction. Patricia never tried to hurt me again. Whether that was because she'd learned to genuinely accept me, or because she knew I had the power to destroy her if she did, I never found out. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd found my place in the Thompson family, not by earning it through Patricia's approval, but by claiming it through my own strength. The glass she'd handed me that night was supposed to be the end of my story. Instead, it became the beginning of a new chapter, one where I was no longer the victim trying to prove my worth, but a woman who knew exactly what she was capable of when pushed too far. 3 months after our confrontation at the restaurant, I discovered I was pregnant. The morning sickness hit me like a freight train during a client presentation, and I barely made it to the bathroom before losing my breakfast all over the conference room floor. My assistant, Sarah, found me 20 minutes later, still sitting on the cold tile, staring at the positive pregnancy test I'd grabbed from the drugstore on my way back from lunch. "Holy shit, Jess," she whispered, crouching down beside me. "Are you okay? Do you need me to call Mike?" I shook my head, still processing the reality of the pink lines that had just changed everything. Mike and I had talked about having kids, eventually, but we'd agreed to wait another year or two until we felt more settled, until the family dynamics were more stable, until I felt more secure in my place among the Thompsons. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was finally feeling secure just as biology decided to throw us this curveball. "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. "I just need a minute to think." But thinking was exactly what I couldn't afford to do. I had a presentation to finish, a client meeting in an hour, and a husband who would need to hear this news before anyone else. I pulled myself together, rinsed my mouth in the sink, and went back to my office to call Mike. "A baby?" His voice cracked on the word, and I could hear him processing the information. "Are you sure? I mean, of course you're sure. You took a test. Jesus, Jess, this is incredible." His excitement was infectious, and for the first time since I'd seen those pink lines, I felt something other than panic. This was good news. This was what we wanted, just sooner than we'd planned. And now that Patricia and I had reached our détente, now that she was treating me like family instead of an intruder, maybe this baby would finally cement my place in the Thompson dynasty. Mike insisted on leaving work early to meet me at home, and we spent the evening curled up on our couch making lists of things we needed to do, people we needed to tell, decisions we needed to make. We were both giddy with the surreal excitement of new parents-to-be, drunk on possibility and terrified of responsibility in equal measure. "We should tell my parents first," Mike said, already reaching for his phone. "Mom's going to lose her mind. She's been dropping hints about grandchildren since our wedding day." I thought about Patricia's reaction, imagining her carefully controlled joy and the way she'd probably start planning the baby's future before it was even born. She'd have opinions about names and nursery colors and parenting philosophies, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't dreading those conversations. Now that we understood each other, now that we'd established boundaries and mutual respect, I was actually looking forward to having her as a grandmother to my child. We drove to Scottsdale the next evening for dinner, the pregnancy test hidden in my purse like a secret weapon. Bob was already looking healthier than he had since the poisoning, his color back to normal and his energy restored. He hugged us both at the door, genuinely happy to see us, and I felt a stab of guilt about the role I'd played in his illness. He would never know how close he'd come to dying because of his wife's hatred for me, and I was grateful for that ignorance. Patricia had prepared one of her elaborate dinners, complete with multiple courses and wine pairings that she'd researched specifically for the occasion. She was making an effort, I realized, not just to be polite or to maintain appearances, but to actually build a relationship with me. It was strange and wonderful and slightly surreal after years of subtle warfare. "You look radiant tonight," she said as we sat down to eat, and there was something in her tone that made me wonder if she already suspected. "There's something different about you." Mike squeezed my hand under the table, and I could see him, practically vibrating with the effort of keeping our secret until dessert. We'd agreed to wait until the end of the meal to make our announcement, to build up the suspense and make it feel appropriately momentous. Dinner conversation flowed more easily than it ever had before. Patricia asked about my work with genuine interest, listening to my stories about difficult clients and successful campaigns without the subtle dismissiveness that used to color her responses. Bob told us about his latest golf tournament and the book he was reading, and Mike shared updates about his accounting practice and the new clients he'd been acquiring. It felt normal. It felt like family. It felt like the kind of evening I'd dreamed about during those first terrible months of marriage when I'd still believed that Patricia's hostility was just a temporary adjustment period that would eventually resolve itself into acceptance and love. When Patricia brought out dessert, a chocolate soufflé that had clearly taken hours to prepare, Mike couldn't contain himself any longer. "Actually, before we eat this," he said, standing up from his chair with nervous energy, "Jess and I have some news we wanted to share." Patricia's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Bob looked up from his wine with sudden attention. The moment stretched between us, heavy with anticipation and possibility. "We're having a baby," I said, the words feeling strange and wonderful in my mouth. "I'm about 6 weeks along." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then Patricia's face broke into the widest, most genuine smile I'd ever seen from her, and she was around the table and pulling me into a hug before I could even process what was happening. "Oh my God," she whispered against my ear, and her voice was thick with emotion. "Oh my God, Jessica, this is the most wonderful news." Bob was hugging Mike and shaking his hand and asking a dozen questions at once about due dates and doctors, appointments, and whether we'd started thinking about names. The joy in the room was palpable, infectious, transformative in a way that made me understand why people talked about babies bringing families together. "I can't believe I'm going to be a grandmother," Patricia said, still holding my hands and looking at me with something that might have been tears in her eyes. "This is the best gift you could have given us." And in that moment, I believed her. I believed that she was genuinely happy about the pregnancy, that she saw it as a blessing rather than a complication, that she was ready to embrace her role as grandmother with the same intensity she brought to everything else in her life. Over the following weeks, Patricia threw herself into pregnancy planning with the efficiency of a military campaign coordinator. She researched pediatricians and birthing classes and prenatal vitamins, creating elaborate spreadsheets and presenting me with printed reports on everything from cord blood banking to nursery safety standards. It was overwhelming at first, this sudden deluge of attention and care from a woman who had spent 3 years trying to drive me away. But I gradually came to appreciate her involvement, even if her methods were sometimes more intense than I would have preferred. She had connections in the medical community, resources and knowledge that made navigating early pregnancy easier and less scary. "I've made you an appointment with Dr. Sarah Chen," she announced one afternoon, calling me at work with the tone of someone reporting a successful mission. "She's the best OB/GYN in Scottsdale, and she happens to be a friend of mine from the country club. She can see you next Tuesday at 2. I wanted to be annoyed at her presumption, at the way she'd made medical decisions for me without asking. But Dr. Chen turned out to be wonderful, and the appointment Patricia had secured would have taken me weeks to get on my own. It was hard to be angry about efficiency that benefited me, even if it came with a side of control that reminded me uncomfortably of the old Patricia. The first ultrasound appointment was scheduled for 10 weeks, and Patricia asked if she could come along. Not demanded, not assumed, but asked. It was such a small thing, but it represented a fundamental shift in how she approached her relationship with me. She was no longer assuming she had the right to insert herself into my life. She was requesting permission to be part of it. I would love that, I told her, and I meant it. Whatever complicated history we had, whatever dark knowledge we shared about that night at the anniversary party, she was going to be this baby's grandmother. And despite everything that had happened between us, I wanted her to love this child, the way grandmothers were supposed to love their grandchildren. Mike couldn't make it to the ultrasound appointment because of a client emergency, but Patricia picked me up that morning with a bag full of prenatal snacks and a bottle of water, and a nervous energy that reminded me of a first-time mother, rather than an experienced grandmother-to-be. "Are you excited?" she asked as we drove to the doctor's office, and there was something vulnerable in her voice that I'd never heard before. "Terrified," I admitted. "But yes, excited too." "I remember my first ultrasound with Mike," she said, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Bob was deployed overseas, and I went alone. I was so scared something would be wrong that they'd find some problem and I'd have to deal with it by myself. But then I saw him on that screen, this tiny little person with a heartbeat, and everything else just fell away. It was the most personal thing she'd ever shared with me, this glimpse into a younger version of herself who had been scared and alone and vulnerable in ways I'd never imagined. It made her seem more human, more relatable, more like someone I could actually have a relationship with. The ultrasound technician was a cheerful woman named Maria, who chattered about the weather while she prepared the equipment and positioned me on the examination table. Patricia held my hand during the procedure, squeezing my fingers when the first grainy images appeared on the screen. "There's your baby," Maria said, pointing to a small bean-shaped blur that looked nothing like a human being but somehow contained everything that mattered. "Everything looks perfect. Good size for 10 weeks, strong heartbeat, proper positioning." I stared at the screen, trying to process the reality of what I was seeing. This tiny creature was growing inside me, depending on me, becoming a person who would change everything about my life and my marriage and my family. The magnitude of it was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Patricia was crying. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quiet tears streaming down her cheeks as she stared at the ultrasound monitor. When I looked at her, she smiled and squeezed my hand tighter. "That's my grandchild," she whispered, and her voice was full of wonder and love and a kind of fierce protectiveness that I recognized from my own feelings about the baby. On the drive home, Patricia was unusually quiet, lost in thought as she navigated the Scottsdale traffic. Finally, as we pulled into my driveway, she turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Jessica," she said, and then paused, as if she was struggling to find the right words. "I want you to know that I'm grateful. For the baby, obviously, but also for everything else. For giving me the chance to be better than I was." It was as close to an apology as I was ever going to get from Patricia Thompson, and it was more than I'd expected. She wasn't the type of woman who admitted mistakes or acknowledged wrongdoing, but she was trying to tell me that she understood what had happened between us and that she was committed to doing better. "Thank you," I said, because it seemed like the appropriate response to this moment of vulnerability. "I know I wasn't welcoming when you joined our family," she continued. "I had ideas about who Mike should marry, and you didn't fit those ideas. But I was wrong. You're exactly what he needed, and you're going to be an amazing mother." I felt tears prick at my eyes, not because her words were particularly eloquent, but because they represented such a fundamental shift in how she saw me. I was no longer the inappropriate outsider who had disrupted her family's natural order. I was Mike's wife and the mother of her grandchild, and someone worthy of respect and inclusion. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, with Patricia involved, but not overwhelming, supportive, but not controlling. She helped me set up the nursery, offering opinions when asked, but deferring to my preferences when we disagreed. She organized a baby shower that was elegant and tasteful and included all the people I actually wanted to celebrate with, not just her country club friends. Most importantly, she never once made me feel like the baby's arrival was contingent on my behavior or my ability to meet her standards. She was excited about becoming a grandmother, period. Not excited about becoming a grandmother if I raised the child according to her specifications, or if I proved myself worthy of the privilege. Mike was over the moon throughout the entire pregnancy, reading parenting books and researching car seats and talking to my belly every night before we went to sleep. His excitement was infectious, and even during the difficult days when morning sickness kept me anchored to the bathroom or when hormones made me cry at dog food commercials, I felt surrounded by love and support in a way I'd never experienced before. Bob was equally thrilled about the prospect of becoming a grandfather, already planning fishing trips and golf lessons and all the adventures he wanted to share with his future grandchild. His brush with death at the anniversary party seemed to have given him a new appreciation for family and the importance of making memories while you could. The baby was born on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 days past her due date, and after 18 hours of labor that tested every limit of my pain tolerance and stamina. Patricia was in the waiting room with Bob and my parents, pacing the hallways and checking with the nurses every hour for updates. When Mike finally emerged from the delivery room to announce that we had a healthy daughter, Patricia burst into tears again. Not the controlled, elegant tears of a woman who cried prettily, but the messy, overwhelming tears of someone whose heart was too full to contain itself. "Can we see her?" she asked, already moving toward the delivery room before Mike had finished speaking. "Give us a few minutes to get cleaned up," Mike said. But he was grinning so widely his face looked like it might split in half. "Then yes, absolutely." Our daughter, Elena Patricia Thompson, weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces and had the kind of pink, wrinkled face that only a parent could find beautiful. But when Patricia held her for the first time, I watched my mother-in-law's expression transform into something I'd never seen before. Pure, uncomplicated love. The kind of love that didn't depend on worthiness or appropriateness or meeting expectations. "She's perfect," Patricia whispered, rocking Elena gently in her arms. "She's absolutely perfect." And in that moment, watching Patricia fall in love with my daughter, I realized something that surprised me. I had forgiven her, not because she'd apologized or because she'd changed her behavior, but because the love she felt for Elena was real and pure and exactly what I wanted for my child. Whatever had happened between us, whatever darkness we'd navigated together, this baby represented a new beginning for all of us. Over the following months, Patricia proved herself to be the grandmother I'd always hoped she would be. She babysat when Mike and I needed date nights. She brought meals when I was too exhausted to cook. And she respected our parenting decisions even when they differed from how she would have done things. But more than that, she seemed to have found a version of herself that was softer, more generous, more open to joy than the woman I'd first met 4 years earlier. Whether Elena's arrival had changed her, or whether our confrontation had forced her to examine her own behavior, the result was the same. She was a better person, a better mother-in-law, a better grandmother than I'd ever imagined she could be. Sometimes, late at night when I was feeding Elena and the house was quiet around us, I would think about that glass of poisoned champagne and what would have happened if I hadn't been smart enough or lucky enough to realize what Patricia was planning. Elena wouldn't exist. This beautiful, perfect child who had brought so much joy to all of our lives would never have been born. The thought was sobering, a reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything and how much my quick thinking had saved. But it was also empowering, a testament to my own strength and intelligence and refusal to be a victim. I had faced down a woman who wanted me dead, and I had won. Not just survived, but won completely and thoroughly. Patricia never mentioned that night directly, but sometimes I caught her looking at me with an expression that might have been respect, or might have been fear, or might have been something else entirely. She knew what I was capable of when pushed too far, and I knew what she was capable of when she felt threatened. It was a strange foundation for a relationship, but it was honest in a way that most family dynamics weren't. When Elena was 6 months old, Patricia asked if she could host a family barbecue to celebrate the baby's first summer. It was the kind of gathering she'd organized dozens of times before, but this time she consulted me about every detail. The guest list, the menu, the decorations, the timing. She wanted my input and approval, not because she was required to ask, but because she genuinely cared about my opinion. The barbecue was perfect. Not perfect in the artificial magazine spread way that Patricia's events used to be, but perfect in the chaotic, joyful way of real families celebrating together. Elena charmed everyone who met her, passed from arm to arm like a precious gift that belonged to all of us. As the afternoon wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself standing on the same terrace where Patricia had handed me that poisoned glass 18 months earlier. The memory should have been traumatic, but instead it felt like something that had happened to a different person. The woman I was now wouldn't have been surprised by Patricia's hostility. She would have seen it coming and been prepared to defend herself. "Thank you," Patricia said, appearing beside me with Elena sleeping in her arms. "For letting me do this, for letting me be part of her life." "Thank you for being the grandmother she deserves," I replied. Patricia looked down at Elena's sleeping face, and I saw something in her expression that might have been regret. Not for the baby or for the love she felt, but for the time we'd lost, for the relationship we could have had if she'd been different from the beginning. "I almost missed this," she said quietly. "I almost missed knowing her because I was too stubborn and too proud to see what was right in front of me." It wasn't quite an acknowledgement of what she'd done that night at the anniversary party, but it was close enough. She understood that her hostility toward me could have cost her this relationship with her granddaughter, and she was grateful that things had worked out differently. "But you didn't miss it," I said. "You're here now, and that's what matters." And it was what mattered. Not the darkness we'd navigated to get here, not the poison she'd tried to feed me, not the fear and anger and hatred that had defined our early relationship. What mattered was this moment, this baby, this family we'd somehow managed to build despite everything that had tried to tear it apart. Elena stirred in Patricia's arms, making the small sounds babies make when they're transitioning. Between sleep and wakefulness, Patricia rocked her gently, humming something under her breath that might have been a lullaby. "She's going to be something special," Patricia said. "I can tell already. She has your strength and Mike's kindness and just enough Thompson's stubbornness to get whatever she wants in life." I laughed, thinking about the combination of traits Elena was inheriting from both sides of her family. She would be formidable, this daughter of mine. She would know her own worth and demand that others recognize it too. She would never allow anyone to make her feel small or unwelcome or less than she deserved to be. "She's going to be exactly who she's supposed to be," I said. And as the sun set over the desert mountains and my daughter slept in her grandmother's arms, I felt something I'd never expected to feel in this house, with this woman, in this family. I felt at peace, complete, home. The glass Patricia had handed me that night was supposed to be the end of my story. Instead, it had become the catalyst for everything good that had followed. My marriage was stronger, my place in the family was secure, and I had a daughter who would grow up knowing she was loved and valued and protected by everyone around her. Sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with poison. Sometimes the greatest love grows from the darkest soil. Sometimes the family you're meant to have is the one you have to fight for, one glass at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.